So, as I said, you'll be notified of recording in a moment. If everybody can mute themselves, please, because we don't want background interference during the evening. We've got a tight schedule, so I'm not going to talk anymore, and I want us to move straight on to our first speaker, who's Matthew Tulley, telling us about Insulate Britain demands. So over to Matthew.
Thank you, Chris. That's grand. So as Chris says, I'm Matthew Tulley, from one of the co-authors of Insulate Britain and also one of the directors of Zero Carbon Yorkshire. So this is about Insulate Britain keeping 1.5 alive. So we are all gamblers, and we all believe that our politicians will make things okay and our children will have a future, and it's all worked for us and we just carry on with life as normal, because that's the way it's always been through our life. And as Radio 2 Good Morning Sunday said this week, it was, don't trouble trouble until trouble troubles us. So are we in trouble? Well, there's obviously lots of different versions of the climate emergency. I particularly like the panorama. So if you haven't seen Panorama Wild Weather, very good half an hour, and it explains about floods and drought and fires and famine and all that sort of thing. The link to that and to the links to some of these other things are on some speaker notes that Shady and Lucy will be putting out later on. So any of the things which I talk about later on, if you're interested in following it up, click on the link later on. The other thing which was interesting, I found interesting, was the Canadian wheat harvest was down 35% this year. So there's a 3-minute link to the Canadian news talking about what Canada's crop has been like. And the interesting thing was that even though the crop was down 35%, which meant the prices were great, so farmers were fairly happy, the actual market supply wasn't that bad because they were entering the year with quite good stocks in storage. But what happens if next year is also 35% low and the year after is 35% low? That becomes more of an issue. So wild weather is about what's happening now at 1.1 degrees. We're heading obviously to much higher temperatures than that. And the IPCC report, again, there's a link to that, the executive summary, which is 40 pages. It is extremely dry reading and probably not that many people will have read it, but it has got some great graphs in, and there are some graphs which I've attached on the sheet. And it basically says, dial in the carbon forecast you want, and you end up with a temperature output. So if we're wanting to stick to the 1.5 degrees and keep 1.5 alive, the carbon trajectory means that we have to halve our carbon fossil fuel use by 2030 and zero by 2050. And as we know, fossil fuel is very addictive. It's invisible, it's easy to use, it's very effective. You know, we just jump in the car and use it, and we live in our homes with the gas central heating, and it's all very easy. Not that many people break the habit of using fossil fuel. I was hoping to do a show of hands, but I can't because it's too many people and things. But it'll be interesting to know how many people here have actually broken the habit and have not used diesel or petrol for the last 12 months and have not used oil or gas for heating their homes for the last 12 months. There are a few early adopters, but there's not all that many friends who you can go and talk to about how easy it is to do. And that's why Insulate Britain was set up, was to produce a plan about how to take fossil fuel out of homes. It's based on non-violent direct action, and that's an ask is to get the homes retrofitted and insulated. The description is in a 12-page technical report, and again, the link is given on the attached notes. But in summary, the 12-page report covers, first of all, the fact that 15% of the CO2 that the UK produces is from homes, and most of that is from gas central heating. About 80% of our homes are heated with gas central heating. The plans that Insulate Britain have are very, very similar to the AECB and the CLC National Retrofit Strategy. Basically, we we copied lots of the very good work that's happened from before. So the technical report from Insulate Britain, the demands of Insulate Britain, how it's going to be done, are very similar to AECB and CLC. It's based, of course, on fabric first, insulation first, and insulation gives the name to the campaign. But of course, it's not the main thing, or it's not the only thing. Insulation is important, air tightness is just as important. And if you make a house airtight, you then have to make sure it's managed for ventilation and damp. So we have sections on ventilation and damp. Heating without using fossil fuels is basically moving to heat pumps. And the government supported heat pumps, but if you look at some of the early adopter heat pumps, it was heat pump only and don't bother about a retrofit. And that's resulted in a lot of bad experience with heat pumps being very expensive to run. So you talk to some people about heat pumps and they'll say terrible things, £2,500 a year fuel bills. And that's because the government was supporting heat pumps without retrofit, which they're still doing in their latest thing. We also have a section in the report talking about hydrogen, because again, that's been proposed by some people. We think that hydrogen is much better used for heavy transport and that sort of thing, if you're going to use it at all. We talk about designing for new climates, because with climate change, the homes being retrofitted are not for today's climate, it's going to be the climate for the future. There's also a section on disruption and planning, as anyone knows who's been involved in deep retrofit. If you're doing external insulation, energy sprung, that sort of thing, disruption is not too bad, it's a few weeks. But if you're doing internal retrofit and managing ventilation and that sort of thing, it's a lot more disruptive. And people have to understand that deep retrofit is difficult and expensive. There's also sections on the resident's choice, because obviously there's different ways of retrofitting a home. If you have an owner-occupier, that's relatively straightforward, because the people deciding what to do are the people who are going to benefit and live in the house. It's much more complicated when you have a tenant and landlord situation. So again, we have to consider when you have a tenant and a landlord, how do you manage that communication to decide what is the best project, what is the best way of retrofitting the home for the tenant who's going to be living with the bills and living in the house, and the landlord who's going to be paying for it. There's a section in the report about cowboys and scams, which was lifted directly from the CLC National Retrofit Strategy. There's also a section on Grenfell Tower, making sure we learn from the experience of the past. And the budget is around 600 billion, which is 1.5 COVIDs. So it's an extremely comprehensive, very expensive, very complicated project. But it is required if you want to take the 15% of CO2 that we use in our homes and stop doing that. So this is a detailed plan produced by Insulate Britain, and it's going to be enacted by politicians. There's a very interesting YouTube video, which if you haven't seen yet, I'd highly recommend, from Arnold Schwarzenegger talking about the fossil fuel lobby and how California became green in spite of pressure, significant pressure from fossil fuel and the car lobby. 7 minutes, very good, and it explains to politicians how they can do this. So in summary, we know that we're in trouble and we know that we're gambling. We have to decide, are the politicians going to fix it for you and for your children's future? Are you happy with the odds as they are now? Or do you want to try and do something about it and change the odds of change? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I think you did remarkably well to compress, I know what you can say on the subject into that short time. I think we should probably flag up the fact that Insulate Britain has been running webinars on as well, supporting the work that is going on with the non-violent direct action, and that will probably, the series will probably start again in the spring, so you could look out for that. We only have one comment, which is around hydrogen for homes, which I think we don't probably have time to really get into, and there is some debate there only about hydrogen and whether it's a red herring, which certainly we could spend quite a lot of time on, so I think we shouldn't pick that up, if that's okay.
Somebody had their hand up, but would you, that person mind typing it in? Yeah.
Can anybody who's got a comment type in, not because we can't pick up hands up very easily, there's too many people, if that's okay. So I think on that note, we will move on, because I know we will run on somewhere. We've got so much to cover. So thank you very much, Matthew. If anybody wants to add comments about Insulate Britain, please do continue to do so. The debate can carry on in the chat as well. So thank you, Matthew. We're going to move straight on to looking at, Insulate Britain is all about government policy, of course, and the New Economics Foundation. I've done that twice today, call it national, I don't know why. I've done some very interesting work on retrofit financing, and I'm going to hand over to Aydin to talk about that now.
Fantastic. Hi everyone, my name is Aydin, I'm an organiser at the New Economics Foundation, and for those of you who might not know who we are, we're a progressive think tank, and since the 1980s we've been trying to kind of rethink how our economic settlement could be more just. And in fact, over 10 years ago, NEF was part of a group of organisations that called for something called the Green New Deal after the 2008 financial crisis, which is a phrase that is now kind of part of our common lexicon, thanks to politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and its adoption by kind of, it's kind of been adopted now in Britain as a kind of programmatic political call by activists and climate campaigners. And I think the Green New Deal is kind of important for me because I think it still remains fairly abstract as a political demand. Like your average person on the street might understand it's got something to do with climate change, but they don't really understand what the demand is, what the content is. And the polling shows this too, right? And so this is precisely why NEF has started to focus in on retrofitting, because retrofitting is for us a crucial kind of linchpin in how you move from green policies, which are seen as taking away from your quality of life. Like most people see green policies as a sacrifice, to something that is giving back and improves your life. And what do I mean by this? Well, if I speak to my mates about green policies, they think I'm going to take their car away, I'm going to take their meat away. But retrofitting is about one of those kind of golden green policies, because it speaks to the kind of class politics that are going to be necessary to win people over. This is about getting rid of the scourge of damp in people's homes. This is about putting money back in people's pockets on energy bills. If you look at the fuel crisis we're going through, if we'd started this work 10 years ago, we wouldn't be going through, people would not suffer the way they're going to have to suffer this winter. And alongside this, of course, is the thing that will appeal to the current government. It will create hundreds of thousands of quality jobs, important skilled jobs. And I think that's really, really important. And for NEF, this work has to be done. But there is no path to net zero without retrofitting 19 million homes in this country. And so in many ways, then, it's not really a question of whether this is going to happen. It's a question really of when and how. And these need to motivate us, right? Because if the when is too late, as Insulate Britain have just highlighted, if the when is too late, we know the consequences, right? But also the how could lead to retrofitting, not being done in a way which benefits the way that it could, right? If you think about George Osborne's failed scheme, if you think about the disaster of the recent Green Homes grant, there's a way in which the government could start throwing money at this problem, but it not be as beneficial as all the things that retrofit could unleash, right? In terms of jobs, in terms of skills, in terms of reviving communities, community wealth building, right? So for NEF, the retrofit necessity is a huge opportunity to do real leveling up. What could be more literal of building back better than kind of transforming our leaky, poor quality, inefficient housing stock? And it's an opportunity to really do that community wealth building within local authorities, create thriving local industries, supply chains to do this work. And so, you can access our briefing on it, but NEF has basically built a roadmap. And the roadmap is really there to try and unlock some of the private finance that is going to be necessary in order for this to happen at scale. So currently, businesses and private finance recognize that there is money to be made here, right? There's 19 million homes to retrofit. So, and there's lots to go around, but nobody is going to jump first while the costs are this high. It's been very obvious for years that the government has got to set pace and show that it's serious, because if it doesn't do that, no one is going to jump, right? And that's why the government, NEF's program calls for the government to kick things off with a serious financial commitment to a national retrofit program. And at the New Economics Foundation, we're basically in alignment with the EEIG group, and the kind of first ask in terms of financial commitment that we're calling for is roughly 11.07 billion over this parliament. And that would be broken up between the 7 billion in insulation and fabric first, and 4.7 billion in heat pumps. And the reason why, that's not enough to cover it all, but that's going to get things going, because we need to bring the costs down if we're going to get that private financial investment. Because this is public money, we think it's really important that this should go into social housing first. But crucially, that this has to be area-based and really centered around local authorities so that they're leading this work. Any national retrofit program must give councils the resources to start with their own stock, so that they can build up the local expertise, local supply chains, help prepare the systems in place for when we move on to the able to pay market, private rented sector, which is going to have to happen at some point. New Economics Foundation is currently actually doing a piece of work with Hampshire County Council on how local authorities can use retrofit to help build back better after COVID, skilling up its capacity, but they don't own their own stock. So this will be with the able to pay markets and thinking about green financing options such as local green bonds, how you can make it, cheap green loans for those who are willing to do the work. So I'll list off the main kind of key policy asks that NEF have outlined. So the first is that commitment to an additional public investment of 11.7 billion. The second is to create and fund the National Retrofit Task Force. And that would have the primary aim of achieving at least EPC C ratings for all homes by 2030. But that task force has to deliver an area-based retrofit program. So we don't want this to be just the government, doing a kind of getting big suppliers in and just, kind of outsourcing. We want this to really be an opportunity to build up local authority capacity, bringing jobs in-house. Really crucial is introduce tax changes in the form of, currently VAT treatment for all retrofit works is at 5%, right? If you want to demolish a building, there's no VAT that you pay. So we have to change the tax rules around VAT on retrofitting work. And then strengthen building regulations, including new mandatory energy efficiency works for consequential improvements, support new business models, standards, so that whole house retrofit is more feasible. And then the kind of final call is to ensure domestic state-owned financial institutions such as UK Infrastructure Bank, British Business Bank offer cheap finance to families and the private rented sector to upgrade their homes and buildings if they've got the ability to pay, right? But really, the kind of roadmap is starting with the social housing and then building out from that. So what have we done so far? Well, we've been kind of working with a number of local councils, Liverpool, Leeds, Bristol, to kind of showcase the work that they've started. We're doing that because we know that the councils don't have the money. And what we want to do is find best practice and say, look at the amazing work that's happening in Cambridge County, for instance. Imagine what could be possible if they had more money. And, finding those stories of how retrofit can benefit people's lives, because it's those human stories that are going to cut through to the public, right? People do not want to live in a world in which they're constantly cold, their energy bills are skyrocketing. And so you want to try and capture the positives of retrofit. And we're also trying to build the base. So, kind of coincidentally, tomorrow we're going to be launching our kind of retrofit Great Homes Upgrade toolkit. And the Great Homes Upgrade is what we're naming our kind of retrofit campaign, because we want to speak to that idea of this is about improving people's lives, improving your home. So the Great Homes Upgrade is going to have a whole toolkit of how local activists can go out into their own communities and start campaigning to put retrofit on the agenda. If you're a green activist, you've probably done something on pollution in your neighborhood. You've probably done something on divestment from your pension scheme in your local authority, but very few people have done stuff around decarbonising housing. This is crucial work. This is low hanging fruit. If we can't retrofit our own homes, we're not going to get anywhere near to where we need to be in terms of net zero. Our toolkit offers people different options around getting in touch with your local councillor, getting in touch with your local MP, how you can build your own Great Homes Upgrade campaign team, how you can start reaching out to local suppliers, in every community we've started organising, we've found that there are people who have been chipping away at this for 20 years, but maybe they haven't gone and met up with a certain membership organisation that wants to go and talk to their neighbours. We've got a persuasive conversation canvassing script. So in Battersea, in my own area, we went out on the doors and started talking to people about their own housing conditions. What are the things that affect people's lives, and then linking it to retrofit, saying, well, if you live with damp, if you live with cold, if your bills are too high, have you heard of retrofit? Is this the kind of thing that you want to demand from the local authority? And I think that's really what needs to happen in the next, we really have months to do this, is we need retrofitting and a Great Homes Upgrade to be something people publicly demand, that they demand this from their government, they demand this from their local representatives. And unless we manage to do that, I don't think we'll be able to get the kind of funding that is necessary in order for this to roll out. So I think it's really crucial that we do this in a language which speaks to people everyday's needs. I'll finish. I know I've got like 30 seconds left. I remember from my childhood when my parents got divorced, the thing that I remember the most about when we were going through hard times is being cold in my home. That is something that millions of people across this country have felt, and they never want to feel it again. And we need to tie that feeling of the insecurity that comes with being cold in your own home and living with damp, and saying it doesn't have to be like this. We can create thousands of jobs, boost your local economy, improve your living standards, and it also happens to help the environment, right? If we do it in that order, we can win mass public support. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This is really exciting to see so many people who care about this in one room. And yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Aydin. That's really interesting, and I'd particularly like to look at more of what NEF's doing on that campaign. And yes, we have got a good audience. We've got 92 in the audience now, including speakers, which is fantastic. There's a couple of things I've picked up in the chat that I'll just pull out, if that's okay, Tulley.
Yeah.
Some questions around obviously the how deep you go and the effect of the elegantly entitled carbon burp. Obviously when you retrofit, you also then emit carbon in doing that activity. And two references there that I would recommend looking at the work that is going on at in Leeds. Dr. David Blue, I know some of his work. Yeah, and also the ACB work. There's a link there to and the ACB's done a lot of work on adoption curves, and how fast you go, and the effect of the carbon burp on total emissions. So interesting work there. There is a question around how we deliver this for you, Aydin, around competent contractors delivering retrofit lack of capacity. One of the areas that we all talk about a lot, and we're going to be addressing in the next session of this in January. But have you looked at that in terms of enabling the supply of skills, really? Yeah, I mean, the thing that keeps coming through is that, even if we wanted to start retrofitting 19 million homes and we had the money to do it tomorrow, we wouldn't have the people. So the skills gap is really important. We're trying to put power into organisers' hands by first mapping our communities, finding out who is in your local area, who's been doing this for years. Are they connected up with their local authority? Because look, in some places there is just not going to be the people to do the work, but there are amazing organisations, Red Co-op, Carbon Co-op, who have been chipping away at this for ages. And how do we get them access to the FE colleges to start? How do we get local authorities to start expanding their work, building up their skills? It starts with building those relationships. I mean, a body of work we're going to be trying to do in the new year in January is trying to get as many of those small skilled contractors into a room so that they can politically organize as well. They need to be lobbying to get the space, the resources necessary for this to be done at scale. And because look, it's a real risk if we get big, huge contractors that don't care about the local community, that just rock up, do bad work and leave. It will be a disaster, and that's happened previously. So I think the key is really us thinking, as much as we are thinkers, as organizers, how do we go out and find the people who have been doing this for a long time, who care about it? Many of them will be on this call. How do we try and scale that up and use the power that we have in this meeting to try and get some resources and get people meeting the right people? Every week I have one-to-ones with people, and you meet someone new who's been just by themselves in a silo somewhere, banging on the walls. How do we get them into the conversation? Thank you. Obviously, there's lots you can pick up there, but there is another query, I think, around should there be some form of legislation for people who do have the money and do have large houses? Would you have a degree of stick in this? I mean, yes, I think there should be incentives. I mean, if you, I'm very frustrated with the delay on the private rented sector. I think private rented sector is the kind of beast that no one talks about, because I mean, I think there needs to be sticks there basically, because it's just unacceptable that it's going to be a number of years now where people can still live in EPC below D quality accommodation. I think that's just horrific, and the government should step up and put in
stringent targets whereby, you know, and the process of us moving in that direction will mean that people have to step up if they have the funding. But we should incentivize it. You know, you should be able to get a cheap loan. If you're getting a mortgage on a new place, I don't see why the Bank of England shouldn't give you £12,000 to retrofit it during that process, and then you pay it back. I mean, that just seems so obvious to me. There should be loads of, we don't have to use a stick at this point because we haven't offered any carrots, you know? So it just seems to me such an open goal.
Thank you. And I'm really sorry, we're going to have to move on just because of the speed. It's like speed dating, isn't it, almost? But it's fantastic because you get really quick input. And that was a really interesting, certainly I should be following up. And just to flag up your post in the chat, your launch tomorrow of the toolkit. So please pick that up, anybody's interested. I shall try to, certainly. So we're going to move on to what you led us to, really, which is community and community retrofit. And Andy Boyle is going to talk about what's going on in the West Yorkshire Better Homes Hub. So Andy, over to you.
Hi, can you see my screen?
Yeah, that's fine,
yeah.
Thank
you. My name's Andy Boyle. I'm a director of Otley Energy, which is a community energy company linked to Otley 2030, which is a community-led climate and sustainability plan for our town. But I'm going to talk about, because a lot of our work's been working with UK Green Buildings Council, Leeds City Council, West Yorkshire Combined Authority and others on this idea of regional programmes to really fill the gap that we're talking about in terms of government policy. So talking about what regions are doing to fill that gap. So just as a bit of background to the Better Homes Hub, which is the project that we're working on with West Yorkshire and Leeds. So it's a culmination of work that's been going on with the Leeds City Council, West Yorkshire Combined Authority, and lots of other organisations really looking at what it's going to take to deliver a retrofitted scale. And so the plans that I'll talk about towards the end for picking up on Aydin's point about area-based approaches, that this is really fundamental to the approach that we're talking about. How do we take the investment that's coming into the social housing sector to act as a catalyst for the rest of the market? I thought, given the subject today, I'd put some context in around my reflections on the UK net zero strategy, which actually, buried on page 61, paints this really compelling vision of the future. Again, the other speakers have talked about that actually there's huge benefits that can come from the transition to net zero. Specifically references homes that are warm, comfortable and affordable, but really paints that much wider picture of what we can achieve in terms of a just transition, improvements to green space, improvements to the way that we move around. And then having painted that positive vision, it immediately follows up with this presentation of the need for a systems approach or a joined up approach, which sits in contrast actually to the very light touch government which comes out in the rest of the strategy. But it really paints this picture of needing to join up an approach to unlock all of those multiple benefits in a way that the private sector wouldn't do alone, recognising the interactions between things like the housing sector and the energy system and the transport system. Really that important focus on the fact that there's really significant barriers to things like retrofit and overlapping barriers that need to be tackled in a systematic way, and really important roles for all stakeholders, including roles of influencing each other. And this, I won't dwell on this, but it's a messy diagram that from the strategy that paints the barriers to electric vehicles, and we know that this exists in retrofit, with really negative feedback loops in terms of these barriers. So things like the Green Homes Grant is never going to work because it's trying to tackle a single barrier around financing. So it immediately runs up against barriers in the supply chain. So this idea of a systems approach is fundamental to the work of UK Green Buildings Council that we've been involved in. And really you can simplify these overlapping barriers by thinking that actually there just isn't a compelling offer for retrofit. It's miles away from being something that the community is demanding at any sort of scale. And because there's no demand for it, there's no incentive for investment in the skills and supply chain, which in turn acts as a barrier. So builders aren't talking to people about opportunities to retrofit their homes. Reference has been made already to the Construction Leadership Councils, which presents the opportunity for a national strategy to start to unlock these barriers. And I think importantly, just touching on that conversation about the carrot and sticks, the work of the Federation of Master Builders says that really if we're going to transform a market at the sort of speed and scale that we need, that there's multiple interventions that need to be put in place, including minimum standards. But really importantly, that emphasis on systems thinking and behaviour change. And a lot of the work that we're doing is really thinking about that behaviour change. What is it? This is the work of UCL on the idea that actually, if someone is going to change their behaviour, they need the capability, the opportunity and the motivation to change their behaviour. And that goes from Boris Johnson all the way down to individual homeowners. So coming back to that idea of painting the positive vision of the future, Boris Johnson's forward is deliberately doing that because actually Boris Johnson needs the mandate. If he's going to make these difficult decisions around investment, he needs the mandate. He needs his voters to be calling for these things and supporting these things. So the heat and building strategy element, which is specific to what we're talking about of the net zero strategy, obviously doesn't go far enough. It talks about the need for a whole systems approach, but gets nowhere near showing how that's going to take place. Really a focus on technology being the answer and trying to introduce as light touch government policy as possible. Talk of minimum energy targets, apart from within the private rented sector. So just not going far enough and really highlighting all of the significant work in progress that needs to take place. So the role of regional delivery programs is really trying to plug that gap. So the work that we're doing with UK Green Buildings Council, with Leeds and West Yorkshire Combined Authority, also Greater London Authority and Greater Manchester, is really looking at this systems approach. So this is the recent action plan released by London councils, which are the 33 borough and district councils in London, and really showing all of those different interventions that we need if we're really going to unlock and transform the market. And this is exactly the approach that we're taking in West Yorkshire, which is about bringing all of those different stakeholders together, including working with national stakeholders to form the partnerships that we need, but really importantly, the delivery vehicles. So there was talk of organisations like the Carbon Co-op who deliver private sector models, but actually we need social housing models, we need private rented models, but actually we need the area-based approaches that have been mentioned previously. But we need that design and delivery across all of these different aspects if it's going to be successful. And so the work, fundamental to the work that we're doing with West Yorkshire and including Martyn from West Yorkshire Housing Partnership, is how do we take the investment coming into the social housing sector to act as that foundation, because it has the opportunity to really provide that volume to start to drive the supply chain, drive demand in neighbourhoods. Leeds have success of working across all tenures in neighbourhoods, so 100% of homes in a street, but coming at it from a regeneration perspective. So really thinking about what's in it for the community. How do we tap into the priorities of the community in a way that engages them and brings the idea of better homes along with the idea of better neighbourhoods. Leeds City Council are committed to working through this process, and alongside Martyn and the West Yorkshire Housing Partnership, that's 175,000 homes that we can start to look at and build this area-based approach from. And just massive benefits to really start to shift the economics, but also the just transition angle. So how do we really make these changes transformative for our communities, both as a means for engaging them, but also as a really important outcome of the process. And this is just that sense of the net zero neighbourhood approach. So moving from just thinking about individual homes to thinking about neighbourhoods, but actually really widening that opportunity to work across different priorities in communities, and actually at a very practical level start to unlock different funding pots. I believe Edinburgh Council are about to release their net zero strategy, and that they really see that actually this idea of blended funding models, unlocking different budgets, is the way to unlock the economics of net zero. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Gosh, there's a lot to take in there. And it's a very interesting model I think you're working with, and it seems to tie in a lot with a lot of conversations around retrofit, that we have to find new ways of looking at. We can't just pick out individual properties, and we've got to be working in neighbourhoods and finding those new models that you're looking at. I think it's really interesting. I've been trying to follow some of the comments. It's been difficult because I've been trying to follow you as well.
There's no immediate questions, but I'm just giving everyone a chance to pose them.
I think one of the things that came up was interesting about whether we should be funding the sort of middle classes when, you know, should money be going to, and how do you mix that in neighbourhoods as well, Andy, in a way? So you're targeting the funding.
Yeah, I think you've got that that sense. If you think about the work of the Federation of Master Builders, that the ultimate stick would be minimum energy standards, and then you've got to make sure that it's a just transition. So you've got to make sure that funding is being provided to those who need it, and that actually a lot of what we talk about is the need for a blended funding model. So that picture of the street that I put up earlier, where you've got all of those different tenures, we need a compelling funding model for each of them. Yeah. For some of them, it will be that they have to pay for it themselves because it's because there's a requirement to, but really trying to make sure that no matter what someone's circumstance is, that they can piece together the right funding model with support. Actually, that it would be a really important part of a one-stop shop model, was that someone sits down with everyone to help them figure out how it's going to be funded, including a mix of grant funding and other funding mechanisms like green mortgages.
And the question, Matthew's asked a question, in the mixed street, how does empty property get retrofitted? Who pays? Private rented property, who pays?
Sorry, did you say an empty property or a?
How does an empty property get retrofitted? Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, it's a important challenge, because actually engaging with empty properties is difficult, because often there's a complex set of circumstances behind why they're empty. So even just the process of trying to get them through to being occupied is challenging. But actually, if you can start that journey then with the right funding model, it would be a simple case for bringing retrofit at that point, because they're a void property, they're an empty property. But yeah, I think every tenure has their own challenges. Yeah.
Absolutely. A couple of other questions. One very quick one: when will the outcome of your work be available?
It's kind of it's available. It's open source. People can get whatever they want from us. But we're about to go through an engagement process. So the UK Green Buildings Council, this design process for what a regional programme should look like, is going to be running over the next 6 months. And in parallel with that, West Yorkshire is part of it and feeding into it and being supported by it. And we'll be going through a public engagement process to make sure that we're bringing all stakeholders into the design process.
A couple of other quick ones. I'm going quick fire here. Sorry. One, well, it's one that may not be quick fire, but I'll raise it anyway. The whole issue of EPCs and the fact that they're not really accurate, don't reflect the energy performance of buildings.
Do you want me to comment on?
I don't want you to go into detail now. I just wonder if you are actually looking at that at all.
Yeah, it's sort of. I think we've got to work with what we've got and try and improve it as we go along. And so EPCs is what we have. I think once you start getting into the building and getting into the design process, then you quickly shift to understanding the actual house rather than what the EPC is telling us. But it's a blunt tool that is the only thing we have at the moment, I think.
Yeah, that's fair comment. And one other, perhaps I'll just pick up briefly, not much time. When you're looking at conservation areas and you've listed buildings, have you got any sort of, you're building that in at all into the sort of models you're doing?
Yeah, I think it's fundamental to this area-based approach that actually and I posted the Letty work on what's the optimum design. I think the whole point of the area-based approach is you can really look at what net zero means in specific circumstances, in specific neighbourhoods.
Yeah, again, it's one you could explore for a long time.
Yeah.
There are more questions coming up.
Yeah, I've just got one that I've noticed that I thought, in a way, like if somebody's trying to do kind of replicate what you're doing in Andy, do you think, you know, like in Sheffield or whatever, how would you go about it, as sort of setting this sort of thing up?
Yes, so we're doing this work with UK Green Buildings Council and Greater London and Greater Manchester, and the whole point is that it's coming up with a replicable model that any region, any city could, but also it's built of individual schemes as well. So it's about regional coordination to make sure that all of the support is necessary, but it's about individual communities doing their own thing and individual organisations and businesses doing their own thing, but just making sure that everything's getting done and being supported. Yeah. Right.
So in theory, Sheffield could try and make it start happening.
Yeah. Well, email me and I'll share everything that I've got, and it'll all be becoming public over the coming months through UK Green Buildings Council.
Wonderful. Great, thank you.
I'll be looking at that from my own local authority as well, Kirklees, but that's for another day. So I'm going to keep us on time, Shaylee, so despite your best efforts. And there are more comments and more interesting comments in the chat, so please keep those coming, even if we can't reference them all in the discussion. There's some interesting points there. So we're going to move on and talk about the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which some of you will no doubt be working with. And Martyn Broadest from Connect Housing is going to talk about experience so far and plans for the future. So over to you, Martyn.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Right, there we go. Hopefully you can see that now.
Yes, that's fine.
Good, thank you. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what West Yorkshire Housing Partnership has been doing in the last 12 months or so on the retrofit agenda, and in particular at the bid we've recently placed to the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. I'll talk a little bit about our experiences and also what we plan to do next, and then I'll just put a bit of wider context at the end. So first of all, the West Yorkshire Housing Partnership was formed about 2 years ago. It was formed in recognition of the devolution agenda and in anticipation of the election of the first West Yorkshire Mayor, who was elected in May this year. It's formed by the 10 larger housing associations, which are all headquartered in West Yorkshire, and plus the 2 local authorities which have retained council housing stock in their own direct management, that's Leeds and Kirklees. And altogether, as Andy said just now, the partnership represents about 175,000 homes across the sub-region. The partnership created a prospectus which aligned specifically to the issues the mayoral candidates were interested in. And each of the 5 ambitions shown on this slide has developed into a priority work stream. I lead on the climate emergency one on behalf of the partnership. As Chris introduced me, I work for Connect Housing, which is one of the smaller organisations in the partnership. We have about 3,000 homes out of that 175,000. I'm one of the executive directors, and my responsibilities are for property investment and development. And of course, now I lead on our response to the climate emergency. I'm also a commissioner with the Yorkshire Amber Climate Commission, and I know there's a couple of other commissioners on the meeting this evening, so it's good to see you. I'll come back to that a bit later on. Now, last year, the West Yorkshire Combined Authority adopted a comprehensive plan to retrofit the housing stock in West Yorkshire by 2038. It's called the Scaling Up Better Homes Yorkshire Plan. Altogether, there are about 1 million homes in West Yorkshire, between them producing 3 million tonnes of CO2 per annum. So to achieve that net zero reduction, we need a 14.5% reduction year on year in CO2. Out of that 1 million homes, about 200,000 are social homes. And as we've heard already this evening, we're challenged by an underdeveloped supply chain and lots of skill shortages. But the plan provides a clear policy approach and sets out a potential financing model, a blended financing model, as Andy was talking about, to support it. And it aims to build confidence amongst the building owners to invest and amongst the contracting supply chain, manufacturers and training providers. So we very much aligned our work in the West Yorkshire Housing Partnership to the Scaling Up plan. A word you'll hear repeated again and again is about collaboration. And certainly in the partnership, we're putting a lot of energy into collaborating on the climate agenda, but also that we recognise through the Scaling Up plan that as social housing providers, as we're major stakeholders in communities, we're an important actor in developing that cross-tenure approach at the neighbourhood level. And the net zero neighbourhood concept that Andy was talking about is a key driver for the plan and for the work that we're doing. So what have we been focusing on so far? So firstly, gathering together stock data from across the partnership to build up a picture of what we have where and how energy efficient or otherwise it is. And the aim here is to identify the collective scale of the challenge, to attack the problem strategically and to see where there are opportunities to work together at a local level. From that, we aim to share knowledge and resource and help create the regional retrofit hub concept, which can act as a driver for wider community engagement. Secondly, we're looking to develop a large-scale solar and battery storage scheme, large-scale pilot of between 1,000 and 2,000 homes, whereby the income generated from selling the energy at preferential rates to our tenants and on a business-to-business basis will generate a return which will allow us to pay for the panels. In other words, it's self-funding PV without feed-in tariffs. Thirdly, we're focusing attention on workforce development, both to broaden our collective understanding of climate issues through initiatives such as carbon literacy, but also to skill up our teams on PAS 2035 and other technical issues. It's still early days yet, but lots of good things are starting to happen. And finally, the thing that's been taking up quite a lot of time lately has been putting together our large-scale collaborative bid to the Wave 1 of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. So the headlines of this bid are 9 partners came together to put the bid together. It involves a total of over 1,800 retrofit measures on 1,300 properties. And together we estimate that will save our tenants about £300,000 in energy bills and save almost 2.5 million kilowatt hours in energy each year. It supports 185 jobs, or it will support 185 jobs and create an estimated 5 new apprenticeships with a total project cost of over 10 million and grant funding of about 5 million. It's a start. It's nowhere near enough, but it's been done within the rules set by the government and the timescales available for bidding. Those rules set targets which in my view are nowhere near challenging or ambitious enough, and also the trajectory for how they're going to use the funding in future isn't entirely clear at the moment. The funding short term, it's got to be spent in the next calendar year, and we also expect it to be significantly oversubscribed. Altogether, so far, the government has released less than £1 billion of its, it's released about 200 million pounds of its 3.5 billion announced in its manifesto. It recently announced another 800 million pounds to be released over the next 2 to 3 years, making about £1 billion altogether. No idea yet where the other 2.5 billion is, and that's still a drop in the ocean, really, because the total estimated cost of retrofitting all social housing in England is over £100 billion. But we see this as, in West Yorkshire, we see this as a down payment, a statement of our intent and a demonstration of our ability to collaborate at scale. And we hope it's going to be the first step towards what will hopefully become a long-term funding deal for the region, aligning funding streams for different tenures and enabling the whole retrofit ecosystem to gear up to deliver the 80,000 plus home retrofits that are going to be needed in West Yorkshire every year by the end of this decade. I'm going to skip through this next slide because I think I'm short of time. Just to widen the discussion a little bit. Everything I've talked about so far is about retrofit, and obviously this is what we're talking about this evening. But it's very important for us as housing organisations to see the retrofit in the wider context of the climate emergency. And for this, I'm going to use a model and the 4 themes of the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission to outline what we need to cover. So yes, getting down to net zero is one of the key things that we need to do. But we also have to recognise that a certain amount of climate change, no matter what we do, is baked in. And that is going to have impact on our communities, whether it be through weather events or other stresses in terms of food or water supply or whatever. And we need to adapt and make more resilient both our buildings and our communities in order to cope with that. Thirdly, we need a just transition. It's been mentioned a couple of times already, but in our world, in social housing, our customers are amongst those in our society who have the lowest carbon footprint, and yet they are probably going to be the ones who are most impacted and least able to make themselves resilient to climate change. We need to help them transition and to a low carbon economy, and hopefully get the benefit of the green jobs and other issues that are going to be around, just like Aydin was talking about earlier on. And finally, even if we're successful in reducing our climate emissions, carbon emissions, and getting down to net zero, if we ignore nature and biodiversity, the planet will die through other means, and everything we need to do has to be done in the context of protecting nature and biodiversity. And for housing organisations, we're owners of large estates. There's a lot we can do to improve nature and biodiversity of our communities, and also engage our communities in that transition. Finally, just a slide with some references on, which you'll be able to look up later, to some of the things I've talked about. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Martyn. And you said you were tight for time, but you were absolutely spot on. So well done.
I've spotted a question, Chris. Do you
yes.
want to, yeah, I'll give you a break from. I think there's
a question about cost.
They're slipping around. Yeah. That was the one I thought probably is in everyone's mind.
So,
sort of what. Sorry,
yeah.
So if your average cost of retrofit is 7,800 per property, what measures are you installing for this money? At what cost?
Okay, the bid we submitted was, as I said, it was from a total of 9 providers, and it covered a whole range of different work. So, for example, ourselves at Connect and one other provider are focusing on the cavity wall insulation program. In fact, in our case, it's the removal of defective cavity wall insulation and replacing it, and also upgrading the heating system. Other organisations are doing external wall insulation on hard to treat wimpy no fines properties. A couple of other organisations are doing individual street houses through a mixture of internal and external wall insulation. So it's a whole mixed bag, and some of our schemes are costing maybe £2,500 a property. Others are costing 10 times that much, if not more. So it's a real mixed bag, and the overall figures, hide the spread.
Yeah. I suppose the question that would follow that, Martyn, would be on the lower spend properties, are you sterilising the house effectively from the deeper retrofit that's going to be needed?
We're very much adopting a no regrets approach. That was one of the stipulations of the funding, probably one of the more sensible stipulations. So I wouldn't say we're sterilising, no. My preference would be to go further now than we're able to. But as I said at the beginning, we are working within the rules of the game that have been set for us. And yeah, as somebody said, if somebody's stopping for directions saying, how do I get to Liverpool? And the guy says, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here.
Of course.
I've got a question. Sorry, it's my own question, but it's sort of, if you could, as obviously you've just spent a lot of time bidding for this money and trying to, if you could sort of feedback directly to the government, like how to improve this, apart from giving more money, what would you say? Have you got?
Well, these are the very conversations we've been having with BEIS about how we need a better deal. We've been talking about the challenges of scaling up, and people have been talking quite rightly about training and employment initiatives and so on. Industry will only scale up, industry will respond where they see some certainty and some opportunity to make money. The short term and the competitive bidding nature of the funding streams that are currently available for housing associations act, to me, entirely opposite to how we need to be going, which is laying down some long-term plans, a long-term policy framework, some certainty about money that's going to be made available to support that programme. We're not asking for it to be fully funded. Most housing associations have reworked their business plans to work that out, that they can probably pay for about half the cost of getting to net zero by 2050. But we do need some mechanism to meet the gap. So the key is some long-term funding circumstances. And actually, if I put my development hat on, the government in the last few years has changed the way it funds housing associations for new development. It now has something called strategic partnership. So strategic partnership, which for the larger associations allows them to have longer term funding certainty, which allows them to develop bigger sites and deliver more homes than they've ever done before. There's an existing model there that government already uses with housing organisations to deliver more than it did before. It needs to adopt something similar in the retrofit space.
And is that what you're taking back to BEIS when you're talking to them?
Yeah, those are the kind of conversations we've been having back with BEIS regularly.
Yeah,
and they don't disagree.
No.
The Treasury holds the whip.
Yeah, as always. Yeah. Right, I'm going to stop there because again we could spend the rest of the evening. There's a lot to talk about there. So we are going to move on. Thank you very much, Martyn. That's and I'll probably come back to explore that more with you, I think, as well. So we've got an extra item we've got in, and I think, Marion, you're going to talk about a commercial development, I think. There we are. We have the presentation up, and I'm going to hand over to Marion. Thanks very much. You're muted, Marion.
Sorry, I lost the mute button at that point. But, okay, good evening, everybody. So a slightly different perspective. I'm going to be talking about a £1 million funded project for the low carbon retrofit of Craven's Council buildings. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project and the thinking behind it. Obviously tonight we've been talking about housing. Now I may sort of move in the wrong circles, but I don't hear an awful lot about non-domestic retrofit. So I hope this will bring a bit of a perspective. So to put it in perspective, if we look at Craven District's carbon footprint, then 24% of public and commercial buildings, public and commercial buildings are accountable for approximately 24% of the carbon footprint. Firstly, key to the project is really understanding where the energy is used. I thought I had a slide, but I've lost it, but it is showing that in terms of Craven Council's direct footprint, i.e. the scope 1, scope 2 emissions, for those who know what that is, that buildings are by far the largest contributor. They're 68% of Craven's direct footprint. So what we did at the start of as we were developing the funding is to look at our buildings and look at the key users of emitters, key buildings that are responsible for carbon emissions. And as you can see from here, we have a leisure centre which is over 54% of the carbon emissions. So this is really about looking at what data we had at that point in order to inform what actions we took or are taking. And fundamental to this, the thinking behind this is to use the hierarchy of energy use, is to reduce the energy demand, first reduce the energy demand, then supply energy efficiently, and then install renewables. So that was the order that we viewed our approach. So one of the first things that we have installed is an energy management system. I think before we started on the project, we had limited energy data, gas and electricity data, and a limited understanding of the building. We did carry out energy reviews of each of the building to understand it as much as we could with what data we had at that point in time, and to look at what measures can be put in place, what is the payback on those measures, what are the carbon savings. So I think key is firstly installing the energy management system. I don't have the graphs, but that is giving us an overview of our energy use. It's giving us our monthly use, daily use, half-hourly use, and then a further breakdown within any of the buildings. And that helps us to really develop our strategy, and for building managers to begin to see and identify problems and peaks in the data in the building and understand those buildings. I should say that, as with many councils, Craven set a target to achieve net zero by 2030 and about 2019, and that was kind of one of the drivers for this project. So we have 7 buildings of very varied buildings. We do have a new build. We have a major refurbishment at Otley Street. We have buildings that have been recently refurbished that are also included in the project. We are tenants in one of our buildings, and we have historic buildings such as the Town Hall, the Crematorium, and Airview House. So a real mix of buildings, and this is kind of a summary of what we have included in the project for these buildings. So I would say that because we were going for that level of funding, what we have included are what I would kind of call middle range measures. So they're not the no cost, low cost measures. They are the middle range ones, because we were specifically looking for funding for them. So just to, I'm not going through all the buildings, just to pick out the key buildings. So this is, as I said, the leisure centre is our main user, and we appointed a specialist designer to look at this. We originally set out to, in fact, way back the original idea was to put biomass in, then we've moved to a ground source heat pump, but actually detailed studies have shown that with an air source heat pump on the water, on the pool water, we can have achieve better carbon savings for less money. So the detailed studies have been absolutely critical on making sure that the solutions are the best possible solutions and the best use of the money and the best carbon payback. Having said that, as part of our investigations, we also sort of identified really understood what exactly we have in the buildings. So for example, that we've already got heat recovery and variable speed fans, and this building is about 20 years old, and I think when it was first specified, these were included in it. So it's really about understanding the buildings and the condition of the services. So we have just put over 500 panels on the top of the leisure centre. I now mention, if people haven't heard of the D&O, that this is one of the barriers in retrofit, which really needs to be moved, in that we had to have the amount of solar panels reduced, although we are not exporting to grid. Our funding doesn't let us export to grid. So with the solar panels that we can put on have been reduced because of the D&O requirements. So if you are installing any sort of energy generator, such as solar panels on large buildings, you need D&O agreement, it just didn't make any sense to any of us that we are installing a heat pump to use the energy, we're installing solar panels, and yet we had to restrict it. At the moment, we have a combined heat and power system already in the building. We actually can't run the CHP unit at the same time as the solar panels. Those are the kind of restrictions that we have been are imposed by these requirements, and I think that it's just the reality, and I think that's one of the things that we really need to be working on, is a change in updating these sorts of risk constraints. I would say that we are in discussions and negotiations to enable us to run everything at the same time. Moving on to the town hall, which is a historic listed building. It has had a refurbishment which completed fairly in the last 2 to 3 years. However, that was more on the museum area. So one of the measures we have is in the middle picture, that is a large concert hall with, if you can see, the plaster ceiling. Well, above that plaster ceiling, there was no insulation whatsoever in the roof. So we are installing insulation above that ceiling in the roof, and it's sheep's wool insulation. We have already installed solar panels as part of the project, actually achieving as a council, we still had to go through exactly the same process for listed building consent as anyone else. And actually getting the listed building consent was probably one of the easiest things in this project. But just a little bit of careful design and so that the solar panels fit within their surroundings. As I said, we've got sheep's wool insulation, and deliberately Skipton actually means sheep's town, so it seemed very appropriate for the area, although it may not be quite as quite as much of an insulation value as other ones, but it has also gained a lot of interest. In this corner here is something which I think is absolutely critical, which is building controls. I have visited, audited, reviewed hundreds of existing buildings, and one of the first things I would go to is the controls, because they are so often buildings are heated, cooled and ventilated when they're not occupied, so for a couple of hours at the end of the day, just because of the settings. So at the town hall, particularly because it's a multi-purpose, multi-use hall, so building, we are installing an online building control system, so we can set when the heating is on and off in different areas. So it's just a very much a whistle-stop tour through the project. I think to say that the conservative target is that we're going to reduce carbon emissions by 30%, 300 tonnes of carbon, a million kilowatt hours of energy a year. I say conservative, actually, when we're looking at the next steps, I said sort of this was a mid-range, looking at the mid-range, actually as part of that, and I think the energy management system is going to will help us, is to really look at the management of the buildings from an energy perspective. From my experience, the very low cost, you can still achieve easily 10 to 20% savings in buildings. So that's on top of that 30%. So that puts us not there, but certainly a bit more comfortably towards the target of net zero by 2030. I think the challenging part will be, how do we get the next part down? Although that's something I envisage that, you know, it'll be in 2 or 3 years' time before we start being able to do that and look for funding for that. It is going to be harder and costlier, but we're just really hoping that in that time there will be emerging technologies and practices that help us address those more difficult issues. We've kind of done the medium. I won't say the easy ones. The easy ones are more in the good management. We've kind of done the medium ones.
Martyn, I think we need to.
Yeah, that's it. That's me
Oh,
finished.
wonderful. Thank you. I thought you were, and I was just not sure. There are questions for you, but
okay.
Thank you very much. But I think we need to pass on those, because I know you were running the breakout rooms as well.
That's right. Yes.
So we have a proposal to have some breakout rooms now, just to let everybody who's been listening. So, you know, it's been so interesting, all the presentations. Just to let us sort of share a little bit. So over to you, Martyn, to introduce that. And
okay. Yes.